Welcome back to Sci-Fi Traveler Science Fiction lovers. In this episode, we'll be listening to the story of Michael and the alien Queen Stella. Ready? Let's begin. I was assigned to do nothing more than protect the alien queen, but we fell in love with each other without meaning to. The recruiter had described the orbital palace of the Corien reaches as a jewel spun from starlight and diplomacy, which Michael now understood to be the kind of sentence people write when they have never had to disarm a poisoned canapé. From the docking arm, it did look impressive. He'd give it that. A vast, pale confection of a station wheeling slowly against the black, all curved spires and glowing terraces, the whole thing lit from within like a lantern somebody had carved out of bone. It was beautiful the way a very expensive knife was beautiful. Michael had spent enough of his life around expensive knives to know the beauty was rarely the point. He'd signed the contract on the shuttle over, thumbing through the clauses with the mild interest of a man reading a takeout menu he'd already decided on. Keep the client alive, remain within a fixed radius of her person, report threats, and then, tucked in near the bottom like a fly in the soup, a line that made him snort out loud. The contractor shall maintain strict professional detachment. Emotional attachment to the principal constitutes grounds for immediate termination. He'd read it twice, decided some previous bodyguard must have done something monumentally stupid to earn that particular sentence, and signed anyway. Detachment was the easiest clause he'd ever been asked to honor. Michael had made a career, and arguably a personality, out of feeling nothing on the clock. They processed him through 3 security gates, a body scan that itemized every old fracture he'd ever had, and a Corien protocol officer who looked at his human face with the frank curiosity of someone inspecting an unusual insect. The officer had the long, tapering ears that marked all these people, swept back and elegant, twitching very slightly at sounds Michael couldn't hear, and pale skin that seemed to hold light rather than reflect it. Otherwise, they were unnervingly, almost disappointingly, like him. He'd been braced for tentacles. He got cheekbones. "You are the human," the officer said, in the flat tone of someone confirming a delivery. "The 5th. 5th's a lucky number where I'm from," Michael said. "It is not lucky here." The officer handed him a badge and did not smile. "The previous 4 are not available for reference. Retired. Deceased." "Ah," said Michael. "That'll do it." They walked him through corridors that curved gently upward and never seemed to arrive at a wall, past courtiers who fell silent and watched him pass with expressions ranging from disdain to something that looked a lot like appraisal, the way you'd size up a horse or a liability. He clocked the sight lines out of habit, noted the 6 places a person could stand and kill someone before the guards finished blinking, and filed them all away in the quiet back room of his skull where he kept that sort of thing. The room was always open. It was the only part of him that never took a holiday. The throne chamber was mostly empty when they brought him in, which he appreciated. Fewer people, fewer problems. And then he saw her, and revised his estimate of how many problems one person could reasonably contain. Queen Stella was seated with the stillness of something carved. She was pale even by the standards of a people who all glowed like moonlight, her features composed into an expression of perfect, glacial neutrality that Michael recognized instantly, because he wore a version of it himself. It was the face of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that showing anything was a tactical error. Her eyes came up to meet his and did not warm by so much as a degree. "So," she said. Her voice was cool and precise, each word set down like a chess piece. "The council has sent me another human. How thoughtful. I was running low. Your Majesty." He inclined his head the correct number of degrees. He'd studied. "Michael, reporting for duty, and fully intending to survive it. They all intend that." One pale brow lifted a fraction. The last one intended it very sincerely, right up until the wine. "I don't drink on the job." He didn't either. It wasn't his wine. "Then I'll make a note," Michael said pleasantly, "to check everyone's wine. It'll be tedious. But I'm from a tedious planet. I'll manage." Something flickered across her face. Not a smile, nothing so generous, but the ghost of the muscle that a smile would use, gone before it finished. "You are amused," she observed, as though diagnosing a mild illness. I'm employed, Your Majesty. On me they look similar. 4 bodyguards, she said, rising now, and she was taller than he'd expected, and colder up close, the way glaciers are colder up close. 4 have stood where you are standing and made confident noises. I have buried all of them and slept perfectly well. Do not imagine you are different. Wouldn't dream of it, Michael said. I'm just planning to be first. She studied him a long moment, and he let her, standing easy under it. Then she turned in a whisper of pale fabric and swept toward her chambers, and he fell into step 1 pace behind, the exact distance the contract specified, close enough to catch her, far enough to feel nothing, and did not yet know he would come to hate that distance. That night, at the 3rd hour, the ventilation grill above her bed sighed open a half-second before it should have, and Michael was already moving. The would-be assassin from the ventilation shaft turned out to be 19 years old, badly trained, and once Michael had folded him neatly onto the floor and knelt on the relevant parts of him, extremely willing to talk. He knew nothing useful, which was the worst kind of nothing. Somebody had paid him in advance, somebody he'd never met, through a broker who existed as a voice and a bank transfer. The palace guard took him away, and Stella watched the whole affair from her bed with the expression of a woman watching a mildly diverting play she had seen many times before. "You caught him," she said, when the room was quiet again. "The others would have caught him too." "The others didn't," Michael pointed out, straightening his sleeve. "The others are a small sample size. Your Majesty, I have known you for 9 hours, and I've already stopped 1 murder. At this rate, I'll run out of murders by lunch." She did not reply, but she did not tell him to leave either, and he took the win. So began the routine, which was where Michael spent most of a bodyguard's life, not the dramatic parts, the long, tedious in-between. He tasted her food, which the kitchen staff resented with a wounded professional pride, as though he were accusing them personally of poison rather than statistics. He swept her chambers each evening for devices, cataloging the palace's endless supply of hidden panels and dead space voids until he knew the walls better than the architects did. He learned through trial and considerable error that the Corien did not eat before sundown, did not discuss the dead by name, and considered it grievously rude to stand with one's hands visible in the presence of royalty, a fact he discovered when a duke went pale as milk, and Stella had to explain, with the weary patience of a translator at a very stupid summit, that in her culture open hands meant I am about to draw a weapon. "On my world," Michael said, tucking his hands behind his back, "it means the opposite. It means I'm not hiding anything." "How exhausting," she said, "to come from a place where people believe that works." The councils were the worst of it. Every 3rd day the great pale lords of the Corien reaches convened in a chamber ringed with floating luminous script, and they spent hours saying almost nothing in the most beautiful possible way. Michael stood at Stella's shoulder through all of it, 1 pace back, a wall in a good coat, and watched grown aristocrats threaten each other's bloodlines over cups of steaming amber tea, without once raising their voices. It was, he decided, like watching swords fight underwater. Very elegant, very slow. Somebody was always bleeding by the end, and you could never quite say when it had started. He began to keep a private commentary, delivered under his breath at a volume only she could catch. "That one wants your job," he'd murmur, as a silver-haired lord bowed. "That one wants your job and your rooms. That one just wants everyone to admire his hat." "That is Lord Varick," she said once, without moving her lips. "The hat is a ceremonial instrument of state. It's a very silly ceremonial instrument of state." The ghost muscle twitched at the corner of her mouth again. She caught it, killed it, and stared straight ahead. But he'd seen. He was in the business of seeing. The thing about standing a pace behind someone for weeks was that you learned them whether you meant to or not. He learned that Stella carried her tension in her shoulders, hauling them up toward her ears through the long sessions and setting them down only when the doors sealed behind her. He learned the difference between her diplomatic stillness and her genuine one, and how rarely the genuine one appeared. He learned she slept badly because he stood outside her door and heard her not sleeping, the particular restless quiet of a person lying very still and losing. She learned things too, though she'd have died before admitting it. She learned he could not be bribed, which she tested twice, once with money and once with information, and which unsettled her more than any dagger, because everyone in her court could be bought, and she had built her whole survival on knowing the price. She learned he told the truth even when a lie would have flattered her, which no courtier had done in years. And she learned that the human meant it, all of it. The tedious devotion of a man doing a job he took seriously. And that was the part she had no defense filed for. One evening after a particularly vicious counsel, Varric had spent 2 hours implying she was too soft to hold the reaches, and she had smiled through every word of it. She stood in her chambers with her shoulders up around her ears and did not put them down. Michael watched her not recover for a moment. It wasn't his business. His business was the door and the walls and the wine. "They can't touch you," he said quietly, which was not professional, which was in fact several inches over the line. "Not while I'm standing here. Whatever they said. Just so you know." She turned. For a heartbeat, the glacial face wasn't glacial. Just tired, just young, just a person. "That is not in your contract," she said. "No," Michael agreed. "Consider it a bonus. Comes free with the food tasting." And she looked at him a beat too long, and neither of them said anything, and the silence that followed was a new kind, one he didn't have a filing drawer for. The second serious attempt did not come through a ventilation shaft, or a bottle of somebody else's wine, or a 19-year-old with more courage than sense. It came at the 9th hour of a formal reception in front of 200 guests, and it was so clean that Michael only caught it because he had been bored enough to watch the servants instead of the aristocrats. There was a rhythm to how the wine-bearers moved, a choreography learned over years of when to approach the dais and when to hold back. One of them broke it, just slightly, just a half step early, a fraction too eager to reach the Queen's cup, and the tray tilted in a way that trays did not tilt when a person's hands were steady. Michael was moving before he'd finished the thought. He caught the bearer's wrist, felt the tendons lock, and saw the tiny glass ampule tucked against the underside of the cup like a pearl in an oyster that very much wanted the Queen dead. What followed was brief and undignified. The reception dissolved into the particular chaos of 200 aristocrats all deciding at once that they had urgent business elsewhere. The bearer was taken. And this time, when they questioned him, he did not confess to a faceless broker and a bank transfer. This time he said nothing at all, because someone had gotten to him first, and the something they had given him made confession a physical impossibility. He simply sat, calm and empty, a lock with no key left in the world. "It's internal," Michael told her, once the chambers were sealed and swept again. "That man had a palace clearance older than I am. Somebody on the inside walked him past 3 checkpoints and handed him a schedule. You don't have an assassin problem, Your Majesty. You have a council problem wearing an assassin costume." Stella stood very still by the tall, dark window, the station's slow-wheeling starfield sliding past behind her. "I have always had a council problem," she said. "I merely hoped it would stay theoretical a while longer. How much of your own court can you trust?" She turned, and the honesty in her face was worse than any lie. "Before tonight? Perhaps 4 of 9. Now I do not know which 4. So they ran. Not away. A queen does not run away," she had informed him, in the tone of someone quoting scripture, but sideways, into the parts of the station that did not appear on ceremonial maps. Michael had spent his first weeks memorizing exactly these routes, the maintenance arteries and dead space voids behind the palace's beautiful bones, and now he was grateful for every tedious hour of it. He moved her through them in the dark, one hand at her shoulder, and she let him, which was its own quiet astonishment. The Queen who trusted 4 of 9 put the whole weight of her survival into the hands of a hired human, because the hired human was the only person in the reaches with nothing to gain from her death. They ended the long night in a maintenance bay far out along the rim, a cramped, humming cavity of coolant pipes and dim amber emergency light, waiting for the palace guard he actually trusted to confirm the corridors were clean. It took hours. There was nothing to do but wait, and nowhere to look but at each other. "You could have taken the money," she said eventually, from the crate she'd made into a throne. The bribe. Weeks ago. Varric offered it. Do not look surprised. I know he did. You could have taken it and simply been slower one evening. Easiest work in the galaxy. Boring, though, Michael said. He was watching the door. He was always watching the door. And I've got a reputation. Very fragile thing. A reputation. Costs a fortune to build. Ruins in an afternoon. That is the reason? A reputation? He was quiet a moment. The pipes hummed. No, he admitted, which surprised him. Somewhere along the line it stopped being about the reputation. He didn't finish it. Didn't dare. Instead, he told her something he'd never told a client. About the job before this one. The one he hadn't been fast enough for. The face he still checked corners for. Why a man might build a wall around himself and take work that forbade him to feel a thing. It was easier, he'd found. You couldn't lose what you never let yourself hold. She listened. She did not offer comfort, which he was grateful for, because comfort from her would have undone him. She simply listened, this glacial, impossible woman, and when he was done, she said, I have never told anyone in this court a true thing about myself. It is a great deal of work, being untrue. I am tired in a way sleep does not reach. You could tell me a true thing, Michael said. I don't count. I'm staff. The ghost muscle at her mouth finally won its long war and became, for one unguarded second, an actual smile. It transformed her entirely. You are a terrible liar, Michael, she said softly. You count. That is rather the problem. The corridors came back clean an hour before dawn. He walked her home through the quiet station and stood his post outside her door, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he did not hear her not sleeping. He heard her sleep, steady, unguarded, finally still, because she knew he was there. And Michael stood in the dark with his back to her door, and very quietly, so that not even the walls could file it away, reread the contract clause in his head. Emotional attachment constitutes grounds for immediate termination. He decided, with the calm of a man stepping off a cliff, that it obviously didn't apply to him. It happened in the small hours, the way the important things did, the way nothing that could survive daylight ever seemed to. Stella had taken to working late in a small private study off her chambers. A real one, not a ceremonial one, cluttered with data slates and the cold remains of tea she never finished. And Michael had taken to standing his post inside the door now rather than outside it, a migration of one pace that neither of them acknowledged had happened. She was reading intercepted correspondence at the wide desk. He was watching the room, and her hand, reaching for the slate, was shaking. A fine tremor, the kind exhaustion left, the kind she would never have permitted a soul to see. He crossed the room before he'd decided to, and put his hand over hers, stilling it against the cold desk. Just steadying. Just the sort of thing a good bodyguard did, keeping the principal functional. He should have taken his hand back after a moment. That was the professional thing. The correct interval. The pace and a half of proper distance made small. He did not take his hand back after a moment. Neither did she pull hers away. They stayed like that, her pale fingers under his, the station humming around them. And the silence did the thing it had been threatening to do for weeks. It filled up, the way a glass fills. One drop, past the point where anyone could pretend it wasn't full. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. And whatever she saw there, she did not correct it. This is not in your contract, she said very quietly. It had become a thing they said. A small private liturgy. No, Michael agreed. In fact, I'm fairly sure this is the specific thing they were worried about. Then you should stop. I know. You are not stopping. I've noticed that too, he said. It's the strangest thing. Very unprofessional. My old instructors would weep. She almost laughed. He felt it more than heard it. A breath, a loosening in the hand under his. Neither of them said the word. The word was enormous, and neither of them was going to be the fool who reached for it first. But it sat in the room with them, patient, having arrived some time ago and simply been waiting for an introduction. The court, unfortunately, was better at reading rooms than either of them was at hiding. It was Varric who moved, of course, silver-haired and hatted and lethal, at the next full council. He did it beautifully, which was the maddening thing. He did not accuse. He worried. He rose, ceremonial instrument of state balanced upon his brow, and expressed his profound concern for Her Majesty's safety, given, he said, with the pained reluctance of a man forced to name the unnameable coup, given that the human protector had, by all accounts, grown close. Attached even. And an attached guard, Varric mourned, was a compromised guard. A guard who might hesitate. A guard who might, in the fatal instant, protect his feelings instead of his queen. He gestured, almost tenderly, at the clause in Michael's own contract, the one drafted by wiser councils precisely to prevent this frailty. He asked, with enormous sorrow, that the human be dismissed for the queen's own good. And Michael, standing at her shoulder, understood two things at once. The first was that Varric was almost certainly the traitor, because only the traitor would want him gone this badly. The second was that Varric was right. That was the cruelty of it. Every word the man said was true, and he was using the truth like a knife because a knife made of truth left no wound the law could see. Stella did not hesitate. He would think about that later. The total absence of pause. The way the glacial mask came down over the woman who had let him hold her hand 9 hours before. She turned her cool, pale gaze on the assembled council and said that Lord Varric's concern was noted and entirely misplaced, that she felt nothing for the human whatsoever beyond the mild regard one held for a functioning tool, that she had buried 4 bodyguards without a tremor and would bury this one just as easily should he prove inadequate, and that the suggestion she had grown attached to a hired mercenary was, frankly, an insult to the dignity of the throne. She said it flawlessly. She said it in the exact tone she'd used on him that first day. I was running low, and she did not look at Michael once because looking at him would have unmade every word. It landed exactly as it was meant to. Varric bowed, defeated, and beneath the defeat something calculating flickered. He'd learned what he came to learn, which was how far she would go to keep the human. And the answer was this far, into a public lie, which means very far indeed. Afterward, in the corridor, they walked in silence, a pace and a half apart, the correct distance, restored. I had to, she said finally, not looking at him. I know. If I had shown one flicker, he'd have had grounds, real grounds. They'd have taken you within the hour. I know, Michael said again. And then, because one of them had to, and it was never going to be her. For the record, mild regard for a functioning tool. Genuinely one of the nicest things anyone's ever said about me. I'm having it engraved. She made a sound that was half a laugh and half something breaking. You are impossible. Compromised, apparently. It's in the minutes. He kept his eyes forward, kept his hands visible, kept the pace and a half. Stella, he knows now, what he came to find out. That's a coup he's building, not a complaint. I know, she said, and for the first time it was her borrowing the words. They walked on, and did not close the distance, and both of them felt exactly how much they wanted to. Varric moved on the night of the Ascendant's feast because a man that fond of ceremony was never going to stage a coup on an ordinary Tuesday. He wanted an audience. He wanted the whole court assembled in the great pale hall under the floating luminous script, so that when he took the throne it would be witnessed, legitimized, made real by the simple fact of everyone watching and no one stopping it. Michael had to give him this. It was good theater. It was also tactically the single most predictable thing the man could possibly have done, which was how Michael had known the date 3 days before Varric did, because Stella had not been idle. While the court watched the human and the human watched the doors, the queen who trusted 4 of 9 had spent those days quietly finding out which 4, turning loyalties, trading truths, doing the patient, lethal arithmetic of survival she'd been perfecting since before Michael was born. He'd handled the walls. She'd handled the people. It was, he thought, a fairly excellent division of labor for 2 people who'd agreed to feel nothing about each other. The feast reached its 9th hour. Varric rose, resplendent, and the doors sealed with a boom that was meant to sound like destiny. Armed men in his color stepped from the alcoves. He began a speech about the frailty of a throne held by a queen too soft and too compromised to defend it. and he was 3 sentences in, savoring it, when he noticed that his armed men were not, in fact, looking at the Queen. They were looking at each other, because half of them were hers. The hall came apart. Michael had rehearsed this in the quiet back room of his skull 100 times. Every sightline, every alcove, every one of the 6 places a person could stand and kill someone before the guards finished blinking. And now he moved through all of it at once. A wall in a good coat, finally allowed to be a weapon. He put himself between Stella and the first blade and the second, and the fight was real, and it was frightening, and it was fast. And somewhere in the middle of it, a man he hadn't accounted for came from an angle he hadn't cleared, and Michael took the knife meant for her low in the side, turning it just enough that low in the side was all it was. He kept standing. This surprised the man with the knife considerably. "Sorry," Michael said, dropping him. "Occupational hazard. Mine, not yours. Well, now yours too." "Michael." Stella's voice, and for the first time in the reaches, in front of the entire court, unguarded. "Fine," he lied cheerfully, bleeding. "Superficial. Barely a bonus wound. Watch your left." She watched her left. She was, it turned out, extraordinary in a crisis. No screaming, no fainting, none of the things a poisoned court expected of a soft queen. She simply became very cold and very precise, and started giving orders that peeled Varric's coup apart at its seams, because a coup only works if the witnesses believe it's already won, and the witnesses were currently watching the usurper's own soldiers arrest his generals. Legitimacy is a magic trick. She'd learned the trick years ago. She was, Michael thought dimly through the red haze at the edge of things, absolutely magnificent, and he was probably going to say so out loud if he lost much more blood, so he clamped a hand over the wound and concentrated on staying upright out of sheer stubbornness. It came down to Varric himself, at the last, cornered against the dais with the ceremonial instrument of state knocked askew on his brow, a small blade in his hand, and nothing left to lose. He lunged for her. The final gamble, take the Queen and take the room, and Michael was too far and too slow and knew it, felt the whole terrible physics of it, and did the only thing left, which was to stop being a wall and start being a shield, and simply be there between them, with his body, contract or no contract, claws or no claws. He never had to. Stella had a blade of her own. She'd had it the whole time, tucked against her forearm in the old Corien way, hands open, meaning, "I'm about to draw a weapon," and she drew it and ended the coup herself with a single unhurried motion, and looked down at Lord Varric with an expression Michael would remember for the rest of his life. Not triumph, just the cold, clean finality of a woman who had buried 4 bodyguards and would not be burying a 5th. The hall went very quiet. The floating script rearranged itself into the formal glyphs of a settled throne. It was over. Michael, having run entirely out of stubbornness, chose that moment to sit down heavily on the steps of the dais in front of the entire court of the Corien reaches. "So," he said to the ceiling, which was spinning attractively, "about that clause." And Stella was on her knees beside him before he finished the sentence, both her hands pressed to his side, all her careful glacial distance gone in front of 200 witnesses, who no longer mattered, saying his name in a way that was not mild regard for a functioning tool and did not care who was writing it down. Michael did not die on the dais, which he considered a strong entry in the win column, though the palace physicians spent the better part of a week disagreeing with his optimism. The knife had gone low and clean, exactly as he'd turned it, and the mending was mostly a matter of lying still and being furious about lying still. Stella came to the medical wing every day. She did not pretend it was an inspection. The court noticed. The court, having watched their queen go to her knees in front of everyone with her hands pressed to a bleeding human, had rather run out of room to be surprised. The reaches remade themselves in the weeks that followed, the way things do after a fever breaks. Varric's faction came apart at every seam once its head was gone. His outside backers, it emerged, had been a consortium of border houses who'd bet everything on a soft queen and lost, and who now discovered with great interest that Stella intended to collect. She did it the way she did everything, coldly and precisely and without a wasted motion, dismantling the conspiracy branch by branch until the Council of 9 was a council of people who had, at minimum, actively declined to murder her. It was not warmth, but it was a start, and she'd been surviving on less for years. The clause was the last loose thread, and it was Stella who cut it, because of course it was. She had it struck from the contract entirely, in full counsel, reading the offending line aloud in her flattest diplomatic tone. Emotional attachment constitutes grounds for immediate termination, and then observing, to a room that had learned better than to laugh at the wrong moment, that the clause had failed catastrophically in its purpose and was therefore clearly defective, and that she saw no reason to keep a defective clause any more than a defective lord. Lord Varick's empty seat said nothing. The point landed. "You could just avoided the contract," Michael pointed out later, when they were alone in the small private study with the cold tea and the data slates, him upright now and healing and unbearably pleased about both. "Torn the whole thing up. Simpler." "I did not want to avoid it," Stella said. "I wanted to correct it. There is a difference." She was standing by the tall, dark window with the starfield wheeling behind her, and she was not cold, and it had stopped being strange to see. A voided contract means you have no reason to remain. A corrected one means you have no reason to leave. I am a queen, Michael. I do not remove obstacles. I rearrange them until they point the direction I prefer. "That's genuinely terrifying," he said, "and I've never respected anyone more." Here was the thing Michael understood now. Standing in the study of a woman he'd been hired to keep alive. He had come to the reaches as a wall. That had been the whole of him. A man who'd built himself into a barrier because a barrier can't be broken by the thing it's keeping out, who took work that forbade feeling because forbidden was so much safer than lost. He'd checked corners for a face he couldn't save, and he'd decided, somewhere in the wreckage of that the trick to surviving was to never hold anything you couldn't afford to drop. He'd been very good at it. He'd been the best wall the Reaches ever bought. And the wall had failed. Comprehensively. Right there in the minutes. He'd grown attached to the one thing he was contractually forbidden from wanting, and it had made him not weaker, but sharper. He'd guarded her better for caring, not worse, seen the tilting tray and the wrong half-step and the coup 3 days early precisely because he'd stopped watching a client and started watching her. Varick had been wrong about everything, and the proof of it was that Varick was dead, and the Queen was not. Feeling something hadn't compromised the guard. It had finished making him one. "I promised your council I'd feel nothing," he said. "It's the one part of the job I failed at completely. Total wash, 0 out of 1. "Yes," Stella agreed. "I intend to note it in your review. Gross professional negligence. Repeated. Unrepentant. Unrepentance fair." She crossed the room to him. No pace and a half now, no correct interval, no distance to hate. And stood close enough that the old geometry of the job simply ceased to exist. The Queen who had trusted 4 of 9 and then not even that, who had built a whole self out of showing nothing because showing something got people killed, reached up and put her open hand flat against the side of his face. Hands open, in the old Corien way. I am about to draw a weapon. He knew what it meant. He knew exactly what it meant. And he did not move, because there was nowhere left he wanted to be but exactly here. And that, too, was new. "On my world," he said quietly, "open hands mean the opposite. Means I'm not hiding anything." "I know," Stella said. "I looked it up. Some time ago." The ghost muscle at her mouth won its last war and became, permanently now, a real thing. Unguarded and unafraid, and entirely his. "I have decided to mean both." They stood in the study a long while, the station humming its slow, eternal song around them, the corridor beyond the door quiet. He would stand that corridor again tomorrow and every day after, one pace behind her through the whole poisoned, beautiful court, but not as a wall between her and the world anymore. Just as a man who'd chosen the spot and would keep choosing it, because it was where she was. He'd signed a contract once, to feel nothing at all. Worst work he'd ever done. Best thing that ever happened to him. He wouldn't have changed a line of it, except of course the one they already had. Michael came to the Corien reaches believing safety was a thing you built out of distance. Feel nothing, hold nothing, and nothing can ever be taken from you. That was the contract he'd signed long before he ever signed the one with the ink. And for a while it worked. Walls always work. Right up until the moment you realize you've locked yourself on the wrong side of them, alone with everything you were so careful never to want. What undid him wasn't a blade or a coup or a woman with elf-sharp ears and a glacier where her heart was supposed to be. What undid him was proximity, the slow, patient tide of standing near someone, day after day, until near becomes necessary, and you can no longer remember why you were guarding your own edges so fiercely in the first place. He didn't decide to love her. Neither of them decided anything. It simply happened in the small hours and the shared silences, the way the most important things in a life so rarely announce themselves and so often just quietly arrive. And here is what the Reaches taught him. What a queen who trusted no one taught a man who let himself feel nothing. That the thing he thought would make him weak was the very thing that made him whole. Caring didn't compromise him. Caring is what finally let him see. So maybe the question isn't whether it's safer to feel nothing. Maybe the question is what all that careful distance is really protecting, and whether the person on the far side of your own wall is someone you'd have loved if only you'd let them close enough to try. Who are you keeping a pace and a half away? And what would it cost you? What might it give you to finally close the distance? The end. Our story ends here, friends. If you enjoyed this wonderful story, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below. You can subscribe to our channel for the next story. See you in the next science fiction adventure. Goodbye, friends.